Welcome to the Alchemy Brothers Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Strong. In today's episode, I am again flying solo as I attempt to unpack a subject that we've been working with closely at Alchemy Brothers across this month, but also a theme that I find is common amongst men who I work with individually and those who come to our retreats and events. And that subject is emotion. Such a big topic, but I hope today to perhaps paint a little bit of a picture of emotion, how we can work with emotion as men, and perhaps offering a little of my experience and a little of my practice in coming back into connection with emotion. But before we get into today's conversation, I wanted to share with you a couple of events that we have coming up on the Alchemy Brothers calendar. The first event is this Sunday, the 7th of July, that we are going to be hosting our monthly Alchemy Sundays. And the theme of this week's session is around emotion. So we're going to take some of what I'm going to cover today. We're going to dive much deeper. We're going to bring it into practice in both an individual sense, but also a dialogic sense. And we're going to come together in support of each other around this big topic. So if you like what I'm going to be sharing today, or perhaps you just want to come and connect with our brotherhood, I invite you to come along to Alchemy Sundays this Sunday in Lisbon. I'm going to be coming down from the mountains of central Portugal to come and offer this workshop. So I look forward to meeting you there. The next event to share with you is our Manifest Men's Festival. This is an event that we are super excited about. It's going to be big. It's going to be powerful. It's going to be transformative. It's going to be a gathering of 100 men up in the mountains of central Portugal at the highest lake in Portugal. We're going to be bringing together a lineup of incredible artists, workshop facilitators, healers, and just to gather in association and in connection with men's work, to dive deep into the subject, but also to just generally celebrate masculinity. There's not enough of that that's happening in the world today. So I invite you to come and join us and stand arm to arm with other men as we dance, we sing, we practice, we play, we work, and we celebrate all that it is to be a man. So I warmly invite you to join us in the mountains of Portugal, 5th to the 8th of September. You can find all the links to sign up via our social media channels. Emotion. Quite a big subject. So I hope today I'm able to maybe just offer a little bit of an overview of the subject, maybe give a few ideas or frames that I see the work of emotion. And just to say at the outset that there's so many different perspectives that we could take on how to work with emotion, how to define emotion, how to frame emotion, how to regulate, release emotion. So I take one particular lens, and that comes from my work as a somatic coach. And I hope that this is a lens that you might find some insight and value from. There are many other different ways to explore emotion. So I just want to add a little bit of a perspective and piece for you in considering how it might apply to your circumstance in your life. Maybe the best way to begin is a bit of a story about my relationship with emotion, which has been a pretty big part of my journey over my transformation from the man I used to be to the man I am today. To paint a bit of a picture for you, I used to be somebody that was perhaps more aligned with the traditional lens of masculinity. I grew up in the suburbs of Western Sydney, and there was, a hyper-masculine tendency, a highly competitive environment, um, where wearing emotions or being emotional was not something that you wanted to do as a man. It was a sign of weakness. It was a sign of fragility. So I was pretty much not able to be weak. I had a big resistance to that. So I had to lean into the masculine traits that I thought defined what it was to be a man, and that was to be competitive, to be emotionless, to be stoic, to be always productive and always on, always active, and always defensive. So this was the kind of environment that I grew up within, and I thrived in that environment. I remember even one moment in the gym change room with a friend. I recall actually bragging and gloating about having my tear ducts sewn shut when I was born because I couldn't cry, because I didn't have emotions. I was not connected to it. And I wore that as a badge of honor. And it's a bit ridiculous as I look back from where I stand now, but at the time, I really felt that that was the way it was to be a man. Now, of course, just because we are disconnected from our emotions, just because I was dissociated from emotions, doesn't mean they were not at play within my life and within my body. And eventually, what I found was that I was in states of low energy, of deep dissatisfaction. I might even call it a slight depression, where I was just not acknowledging or being with my emotions. In that scenario, I decided to leave my hometown, leave my place of employment, and go traveling. And just bought a one-way ticket and started to journey around Europe. It began with, but eventually it started to come into a journey through my body. I got into touch with yoga, which eventually led me into movement culture, embodiment work, somatic therapy, breath work, these kinds of body-based modalities. And as I journeyed through those experiences, I came more and more into contact with my body and into relationship with my body. Prior to those experiences, my body was something that I was subjugating with force, with willpower. I was forcing myself to go to the gym, forcing myself to race, forcing myself to conquer and beat the environment, the opponent, whatever the case was, which came through conquering and beating myself. So as I started to come through these practices, I started to come also into a sensitive relationship with myself. I was more tuned into the very subtle shifts, the subtle movements, the subtle tensions and vibrations that were occurring within my body. And as I was more aware of my body, I became more aware of the emotional responses that I would have due to the world, due to others that I was in relationship with. So I was becoming more and more emotional. And I also recognized that the more I was aware of what was occurring within my body, the more sensitive I was to the feelings and the sensations of others as well. I started to tune in more to what others were feeling and what others were experiencing. And this came as a bit of a shock to me, but it was this kinesthetic empathy that was developing. The more I was able to be in tune with my own body and aware of the subtle shifts, the subtle changes, the more I was able to register that within those that I was engaged with. So those things, those tools that I managed to develop, these qualities of being empathic and sensitive, these inevitably have been valuable for me in my work now as a somatic coach and therapist. All of a sudden, those gifts allow me to explore the clients' lives and experiences and relationships with a lot more sense of depth and integration. A big shift from someone who was previously labeled by previous partners as emotionally unavailable, difficult to read, unable to know where I stood, to all of a sudden being empathic and sensitive. It's a significant shift, and it was a retrospective appreciation of how much I had changed through this journey through my body. Also, to say that at some point in that journey, I did feel that I swung a little bit too far in the other direction. I went from being emotionally unavailable, emotionally dissociated and insensitive, to maybe hyper sensitive, hyper emotional, and hyper aware, such that I was becoming overwhelmed by some of the emotional experiences that I was having. And some of them were not even my emotional experiences. I was being overwhelmed by the emotional experiences of another. So I swung too far into this experiencing and expressing place. And inevitably, I had to come back and find some kind of balance, somewhere between the kind of the stoic masculine archetype that I left behind and this more, let's call it more feminine, expressive, experiencing place. There was somewhere in the middle that I needed to find my own balance in. And I believe that I have come to a more balanced place now. Of course, there's always fluctuations, but I think by experiencing both ends of that spectrum, I have been able to come back into some kind of state of balance in between. Emotion seems to be a pretty substantial subject for any man that steps into my work or steps into our retreats. Often the experience is something around not being able to connect with emotions, which means perhaps that they're dissociated or that they're numbing themselves, so unable to tap into the emotion, or they are completely riddled with the emotion, that they have outbursts of anger or outbursts of grief or outbursts of uncontained excitement or joy that they're not able to regulate. So we can see that sometimes they occur on both sides, this inability to connect with emotion and this overwhelm due to emotion. Now, what would be ideal in the scenario is to be able to feel our feelings, to be able to be informed by our feelings, and to be able to regulate and process our feelings in ways that are adaptive to the circumstance we find ourselves in. It's relevant to the relationship, it's relevant to the environment, it's relative to how we want to be in the world. So, how can we go about unpacking this subject? And perhaps a place that we might jump in is around the etymological root of the word emotion. Now, just there, the word motion gives an implication of movement, and it comes from the root of emover, which is to move out. So the implication just in the language, just in the word, is that there's something within that needs to be moved out. There's a movement, there's an expression, there's a motion that is occurring uh, from the internal to the external. Now, the emotions that we experience, as I'm sure you have an appreciation of, they can come with different gradients of intensity, which come with a different capacity for us to regulate ourselves. And when we're experiencing, let's say, the grips of a really intense emotional experience, I'm willing to bet that you have a sense that when you are in this extreme anger or extreme grief or extreme even excitement, right? You're not really in the best place to make grounded, centered decisions about your life, about the decisions in your life, about your relationships that you're in. You are in this place of highly charged emotional response, and any decision that comes or any words that come through and from that place is likely not a great representation of who you are and who you want to be. Yet we seem to be in situations where we inevitably make decisions from that place, and in the aftermath of which come to maybe regret how we were. Maybe we don't understand why it was that we made particular choices or took particular actions. And it's all well and good when the stakes are small, but sometimes these decisions are around, relationships, being with a partner or not being with a partner, being in a job or not in a job, being taking particular directions in our lives, committing to particular things. I know that I'm guilty of when I'm really in an excited place, I tend to overcommit. I tend to get excited and I make all these promises that I just when I'm in that state, I feel I can deliver. And then when I'm come back to a calm, grounded, centered place, recognizing, oh boy, I've just overcommitted myself. And then I need to peel back somehow those things that I've committed. So it's not just the anger, it's not just the sadness, it's not just the shame, but it's also the joy and the excitement. When we are in the peaks of these emotional experiences, we are likely not making decisions that are considering the entirety of our life and the entirety of our circumstance and the entirety of our capacity to engage in those kind of ways. But the emotions, they give us a hell of a lot of information about how we might want to act. As my mentor would say, your emotions or your feelings, they tell you what matter, in what way it matters, and to what degree it matters. This is important, so I'm going to say it again. Your feelings, well, they tell you what matters in your life, in your world, in your relationship, in what way it matters, and to what degree it matters through the intensity of that experience. So if we are open to receiving the information of our emotional experience, and if we are able to be aware of and tuned into that information, yet not be overwhelmed by it and make decisions from an overwhelmed place. But if we're able to come back to a regulated, centered place, having been tuned in and informed by emotions, we are in the best place to make decisions in our lives, in our relationships, with what we do, what we say, and how we are, to bring about the kind of future that is in true alignment with who we are as a person and what we want in the world. The inverse is also true. If we respond from a place of, this place of overwhelm where the emotions are too great to really allow us to perceive the situation clearly, or if we are cut off from our emotional compass altogether, if we have no sense of what matters to us, well, we're going to make decisions that we think are best in the moment, or that what the emotional peak is guiding us towards. What that will inevitably lead us to is decisions that's going to take us into places and spaces and relationships that are not true to who we are. They're going to be situations that are likely going to cause us more stress because of the incongruency with who we are. And then when we're in a stressful space and we're being triggered by that environment, we are more likely to then be in these heightened emotional states or in these emotionally numb states. And then we're going to make more decisions that are not in alignment with the kind of people we are. And then that's going to exacerbate. And this becomes quite a vicious cycle when when it really is left to unfold in that way. So what would be the way to meet either of these two ends of the extreme, the emotional numbness or the emotional overwhelm? I would put a case forward that emotional regulation should be the aim of the game, or could be the aim of the game, coming back into some kind of centered, regulated place such that the information of the emotions informs us, but does not inhabit us, does not inhibit us, just informing what we then do with that information. One way of emotional regulation that I think has gotten quite a lot of attention through social media is this idea of emotional release. And the thing that seems to be sensationalized in a way is the big cathartic release. It's the big scream in the pillow, the primal scream, the throwing, the bashing, the boxing, whatever it is. There's this big cathartic release, and this idea that that is then going to bring us back into a regulated place. Now, I don't want to discount that as a tool for emotional regulation. My personal perspective is that then needs to be really contained in a context that supports the the setting up of that kind of a scenario, but also the integration of that kind of a scenario. There was a client that I worked with that was experiencing issues with his anger management. So he was in a workplace, he was in a relationship that would trigger these angry responses. So at the end of each day, he would go to the gym and he would unleash his anger on the boxing bag. He would then go home and feel the release, the calmness that comes after such an effort, such an expression of energy. However, it did very little to change the context within which the anger was being triggered. He was still working in the same environment. The same patterns were still unfolding with his partner. So rather than being informed by the anger, he was just expelling it, just letting go of the floodgates or emptying the vent, taking away the pressure, which, again, I don't want to discount that kind of a work. However, if we're able to tap into the information that's contained within the anger, we can then employ that information to make meaningful changes within the context of our lives, such that we can create something that's a little bit more stable, a little bit more in alignment with who we are. So I think rather than necessarily emotional release, we should be orienting towards emotional regulation, which may include, but does not necessarily include those big cathartic releases. And in fact, in this particular talk, we're going to look at a different way of meeting those emotional experiences and regulating in the face of them. A frame that I could perhaps introduce at this point is around this dynamic between the masculine and the feminine. Now, of course, we know that the masculine is present in both males and females, and the feminine is present in also both males and females. These are labels for energetic states, masculine and feminine energy that resides within each of us. And I like the work of John Wineland in how he frames the main energetic orientation of each of these polarities. The masculine is conscious awareness. It is the ability to witness what is taking place within ourselves or within another, the ability to be aware of the totality of experience. The feminine is experience. The awareness of the masculine contains experience, and the feminine is the experience. It's the movement, it's the flow, it's the expression, the expression of experience. So if we were to look at emotional release in a cathartic sense, this would be a feminine practice. There is an expression that goes along with that. And in fact, a lot of the work that we get into at many of the men's offerings that are offered around the world are feminine-based practices. The movement, the primal screaming, the sharing circles, the ice baths, all of that is feminine-based practice. On the other side, we have the masculine conscious awareness, and you can bring your attention perhaps to something like a meditative practice. It's being able to witness the emotional experience, to be able to witness the sensations, the feelings, and to contain that, to hold that, to be with that. For each of us, we may need to work and practice on one of these sides of the coin. For a man who is perhaps more stoic, he doesn't express his feelings at all through any means, maybe he needs to come into a more feminine-based expression. Maybe he needs to explore some of those methods of expression and release and come into touch with his feminine. But equally, those that are perhaps more prone to just unloading their experience all the time upon another, maybe they need to come back into a more aware place, a more conscious place, a place of witnessing their experience and not just expressing the experience. Again, what the ideal, I believe, here would be is to integrate these two expressions or these two polarities, to be able to move into each of these places as is necessary to the context and the dynamic and the circumstance and what we are seeking to bring. I find it's useful to have both ends of these tools, and this shows up as well in, in my own personal life. If I was to give an example, I recently had a son, and the additional stresses that come with a newborn baby, the lack of sleep, the doubt and uncertainty around different aspects of feeding and health and everything that goes along with having a baby, well, that brings a lot more pressure, a lot more stress upon the relationship. And my partner in various moments was, depleted, sleep deprived, and not in a great place to have deep, emotionally open conversation. In those moments, if I was to come to her and tell her all of the things that I was feeling, all of the challenges that I was going to, and asking her to receive that, it wouldn't have necessarily been welcomed. It would have just added on to what she was already dealing with. So, in those scenarios, my role was to be more in my masculine. It was to be more this conscious awareness, to feel my emotions, but also to hold her emotional experience as well. So fortunately, I have groups of men and individuals that I can go to talk about those things with them. And then eventually, when the relationship is at a level where we have a little bit more sleep and perhaps a little bit more energy resourced, I can bring those conversations to my partner. And quite likely, by the time that happens, I've already been informed by the emotion. I understand what I need to communicate in a much clearer, grounded, and calm way. So it's important to be able to move between these two ends of emotional regulation with adaptability, with smoothness, with grace, depending on the scenario within which you find yourself. If we are able to meet some of these bigger emotional experiences, some of these more overwhelming emotional experiences, and we are really able to tune in and be aware of what is taking place, this kind of a practice can work from those big emotional experiences, and then we can slowly become more attuned to the subtle signals of our perhaps the more subtle emotional movements on a day-to-day basis. And likewise, we can invert that and we can start from a place of tuning into the subtle, such that we are practiced and rehearsed for regulating ourselves when those bigger emotional experiences come. The key word here is practice. We practice when we are feeling calm, content, stable, and we practice when we are feeling dysregulated, overwhelmed, and in the grips of an emotional experience. Why? Because if we practice when things are going well, we are better equipped to practice when things are reaching a point of higher stress. So I would like to introduce to you a very simple practice that I use on a regular daily basis with both myself and with the clients that I work with. So I invite you, if you would like, to just take 5-10 minutes to settle in and perhaps come to a seat. If you have the availability, you might want to close your eyes. And if you do not have the availability, if you're in a situation where you cannot do so, perhaps you can just listen along to this exercise and then practice in a moment that you do have a little space. So as you land, wherever you are, I invite you to take notice of the way that your body makes contact with the support beneath you, the chair, the ground, perhaps through the feet, through the legs, through the sit bones. Maybe you notice the natural rhythm of your breath, how deep or shallow the breath is, how fast or slow, maybe even where you sense the breath more clearly. And having checked in with both the sense of support and the breath, I invite you to ask yourself a question. And it's going to be a series of 3 questions, but we're going to start with the first simple question of how are you? Now, maybe the answer to this question is obvious. Maybe it's quite salient to you what your state of being is in this moment. Maybe it takes a moment or two. So, how are you? And how do you know how you are? This second question that invites us to check in with our embodied experience. What is it that you're sensing within yourself that contributes to your state of being? The patterns of tension, the patterns of sensation, patterns of heat, cold, vibration. How do you know how you are? And what's not uncommon is that as we investigate the second question, sometimes it changes our perception of what the first might have been, the first answer that we gave to that question. Maybe now, having checked in with the physical sensations, what we notice in an embodied sense maybe changes somewhat our original check in. The third question, having checked in with how you are and how you know how you are, what is being asked for by your emotional state? If you were to allow the emotion a moment to run free, where would it go? What would it do? What would it say? What is the emotion asking for? And I invite you to sit with that for a few minutes. One of the ways that we are able to process our emotions is through these 3 stages. It's being able to label the emotion, to state clearly what we feel in an emotional sense. It's then being able to experience that as physical sensation. And then finally, it's to understand what is being asked for, what is being explored from the impulse of that emotion. Now, across time, as I mentioned, this is a practice. And this is something that's practiced when we're feeling calm, content, balanced, grounded. And this is something that we can practice when we're feeling angry, sad, grief, scared, fearful. All of these places are a different territory for exploration. And it's only by coming to this practice again and again and again that we can begin to really tune into the subtle shifts and changes between our experience of emotion and our experience of ourselves. Now, if you're still sitting, paying attention, I invite you, before coming back to the screen or before letting go of this exercise, if there is one small action that you can do that would bring you in closer alignment into the future that you would like, based on the information that you have understood, maybe take that action. Maybe it's as simple as a drink of water, or it's a stretch, or it's a shout, or maybe it's something a little bit more complex. But just do that one small thing. If we make a practice of being with ourselves, being with our emotions like this, we are able to meet ourselves more authentically, more truly, and we're able to express ourselves more authentically and more truly. This simple practice, it invites us to integrate both the masculine and feminine aspects of the polarity, to become aware of, to sense, to witness, and then to take action or expression of what we notice. As I mentioned before, this is useful for when the emotional experience is subtle or when the emotional experience is overwhelming. If we can just pause, simply create a space. If you're in the midst of this big emotional experience, rather than doing the thing that you impulsively might do, take a time out, take a walk, take a pause, sit down, pay attention, feel what you're feeling on a visceral level. Imagine what it is that that emotion would like to enact within the world, and allow it freedom. Don't get in the way here. Don't intersect. Don't defend. Don't block. Don't judge yourself for having the impulse or the thought of the emotion. You don't need to necessarily go out and enact the impulse. It's more understanding what the emotion is asking for. But with that information, with that emotional processing that's undertaken, you are then better informed and a little bit more grounded, a little bit more centered, such that you can re-engage with the dynamic, with the environment in a more composed kind of way and make decisions that are going to bring you progressively in greater alignment with who you are, to find yourself in relationships, to find yourself in spaces and environments that support and nourish that kind of person that you are. It's a practice that we meet ourselves in again and again and again, and a practice that I have been undertaking for many years now. And I would encourage you to just simply try it out. Try it on, try it for a week, 2 weeks, commit to a particular amount of time, and notice how things might shift and change within that window of time. So, with that, I think and I sense that we're bringing this conversation to a conclusion. I hope that there's been some value in what I've shared here. And there's so many different threads that we could have pulled, so many different avenues that we could have gone down, but those are better left for another conversation, another time. But if you find what I've been sharing today of interest, then please consider coming to our Alchemy Sundays this Sunday, the 7th of July. It would be a privilege and an honor to be able to meet you and to share in circle with you. And if you have any feedback, if you have any questions that come up from this content, from what I've shared here, please, you can drop that into our Spotify questions, or you can just reach out to me directly and let me know your feedback, let me know your questions, and we will try to pick that up and address it either together or in a future conversation. And with that, thank you for listening.